10 p.m., Friday, August 19th, 1977. Ron Gillespie angrily hangs up the phone. His daughter Tracy heard him screaming at someone on the other end for several minutes. Frustrated and a little buzzed, Ron grabbed a gun and stormed outside, peeling down the rural country road, Florence Chapel Pike in his 1971 Ford Sport Custom. Most sources claim he moved with a purpose, that he probably believed he knew who was calling and planned to finally confront them. See, Ron had been the recent target of a relentless campaign of harassment. This was his home. 50 minutes later, the crash was discovered on the side of 5 Points Pike. It takes 10 minutes, driving the speed limit, to make the journey between the 2 points. Ron wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and after failing to round the bend, he impacted a tree and quickly succumbed to massive internal injuries. Police found he'd fired a round from his .22 revolver, but never located the casing or the bullet. According to Ron's stepbrother, Paul Freshore, Pickaway County Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe said privately he suspected foul play was involved. Radcliffe would later change his mind and dismiss the death as an accident. Ron's blood alcohol content was 1.5 times the state's limit, but his family pointed out that he wasn't much of a drinker and hadn't had anything all that day. Still, the .16 BAC made it easy to brush the case under the rug. Questions remain unanswered about his mysterious death, mainly if he didn't drink that day, where did he go to get drunk? 5 Points Pike is a 10-minute drive from his home, less if he were speeding, but he was found on the side of the road 50 minutes later. What happened in that 40-minute window? After all, this is a rural road, but not so remote that you could go nearly an hour on the side without being noticed. Where did he fire his gun? Was it an angry shot fired at random into some field, or did it happen in that 40-minute window? Was he being pursued by another vehicle? Where was he driving? He moved as if he was on his way to meet someone. Ron lived and worked around Circleville, but drove the opposite direction through Darbyville in the direction of Mount Sterling, but something made him veer off the main road and onto 5 Points Pike, passing the Methodist Church and the Monroe Men's Club in this small farming community. It's very possible the mystery caller told him to meet him in Mount Sterling or in London, but caught him driving late at night by following his headlights as he passed through Darbyville, minutes away from his rural home. Most importantly, who was the man on the phone, who had been harassing and threatening Ron and his family for months? On that fateful day, Gillespie took Florence Chapel Road, turned left onto... Officially, Ron's death was an accident. The infamous Circleville letter writer was never caught. But it did become clear that some officials in town were very corrupt, and although this may not relate to Ron Gillespie's death, it left a bad taste in many people's mouths. So before we go on, let's explore a little bit about the early life of Ron Gillespie. Ron was born in Baltimore in late 1941. His parents were David and Olive Gillespie, both Kentucky natives of the Ohio-West Virginia border area. After their first son, Roger, died in childbirth, the young couple moved to Baltimore and succeeded in having Ron. Happy that their baby was quickly growing into a young boy, they moved back to Boyd County, where Mother Olive was from, and had another child, Karen Sue Gillespie. Ron would be her mentor, and the two remained close after adulthood, moving not far from each other in southern Ohio. A few years after Karen was born, Olive and David had another son, David Jr. Ron was about 10 years old at that time. Sometime over the next decade, the Gillespies moved to the Circleville area, and in 1961, Ron married a local girl, Mary Hinton, the daughter of Private Bill Hinton, killed on the first day of the Battle of the Bulge. Mary was a baby at the time and never knew her father for the hero that he was. The two were in love, and eventually Ron's sister Karen married another semi-local man named Paul Freshore. He was born a little further north in Meigs County, but worked in Columbus as a quality control inspector at the Anheuser-Busch factory, living near his parents. This meant he was often half an hour north of Circleville. The four, Ron, Mary, Karen, and Paul, were fast friends, although Ron's wife didn't always get along with Paul Freshore. Meanwhile, the young Gillespie couple had 2 children, and Mary Gillespie worked as a bus driver at Westfall School outside of Circleville. The superintendent of this school system was Gordon Massey, a veteran of the Korean War. He likely knew the Gillespies very well because both he and Ron were members of the same Masonic Lodge in Circleville, next to the county courthouse. Also a member of this same historic lodge, Lodge number 532, was the sheriff Dwight Radcliffe. Ron was likewise a frequent visitor and member of the local Elks Lodge on the same street. Many of the involved parties probably knew each other through these sort of fraternal and familial ties. On March 3, 1977, the Circleville letters began. The target initially was Gordon Massey, the superintendent, a community leader with a wife and children. This letter was left in his inbox and warned him to stop flirting with, quote, my girls. The letter reads, Dear Sir, according to my GF, you have asked her to go out many times and have asked the other female bus drivers too. This must stop at once for the good of the school and families. If they are not stopped, I will be forced to write to the school board, and I would hate to do that. To prey on another man's girl is untouchable. I suggest you find yourself a pimple-faced whore and start with her and leave my girls alone. The next day, a similar letter was sent to the school board. There was no return address, just a label, number 2. This letter was 4 pages, mostly accusing Superintendent Massey of sexually harassing bus drivers, ending with the vague threat, I sure hope this does not upset my girl for his sake. A third letter arrived that very same day, addressed similarly, with attention to Gordon Massey, claiming he was daily watching him flirt with specific bus drivers. The high school is essentially in an open field, and it would have been very easy to stake the bus lot out with binoculars. The stalker would either have to have been a student, faculty, or a very dedicated onlooker. On March 18th, the vice principal was sent a letter claiming that driver number 62917 was having an affair with the superintendent. The letter claimed this driver had a child going to the same school. Initially, the author didn't name Mary Gillespie, but this was her driver's number. Around this time, Mary was receiving similarly vague, threatening letters. They read much the same as the ones to Massey, that the writer was watching them, that he knew where they lived and what their children's names were, that he followed their morning commute and knew which vehicles they drove. In early April, a letter arrived for Ron Gillespie claiming his wife was having an affair. These new letters had a return address of 550 Ridgewood, the home of Superintendent Gordon Massey. This was the first time Ron started getting harassed. They mentioned his truck and threatened to do something vague to him if he did nothing to stop the supposed affair. He confronted his wife, and she admitted to receiving similar letters in the past, but denied cheating. Years later, Mary supposedly admitted to this affair, but specified it didn't begin until after the letters had already started. Ron and Mary Gillespie assembled some of their friends and family and drew up a list of possible suspects. At the meeting was Ron's sister Karen and her husband Paul Frashore, a man who became the main suspect years later. Those assembled agreed that David Longberry was the most likely culprit. He was a bus driver and flirted with Mary a few years earlier, but was rebuked. He didn't take this well, but he did continue to see Mary every day at work. The family assembled in Ron's home agreed to start sending letters to Longberry, demanding that he stop. For a while, this seemed to work. Almost as though the break made the stalker more furious, though, he ramped up by planting signs that would be seen by Ron and Mary as they drove to work. While driving to town, Ron passed a large sign accusing him of raping his 12-year-old daughter, Tracy, a totally new and unfounded accusation. The sign was planted obviously on Ron's way to work, and over the next few days, more signs would appear on Mary's drive to school and on her bus route. This specific campaign of harassment lasted several weeks. Now we're back to the beginning of the video, Ron Gillespie's last day on Earth, Friday, August 19th, 1977. The family dynamic around the rural Gillespie home, as far as I can tell, was strange. Ron loved his sister, Karen, and Mary took kindly to her as well. Karen's husband, Paul Frashore, was usually working in Columbus, and she spent a lot of time with the Gillespie couple, where she and Mary became fast friends. Earlier that day, as was agreed on by both Ron Gillespie and his sister's husband, Paul Frashore, the two set off on a girls' trip to Florida. Around 10 at night, Ron got a call. He seemed incensed. His daughter Tracy said he was yelling before he stormed out. Less than an hour later, he would be found dead, wrapped around a tree with a freshly fired revolver and a blood alcohol content of .16, which didn't seem to match what he was at before he left the house. Supposedly there was a cover-up. Now the last thing I want to do is defame the good reputation of Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe, a man who really deserves a movie about his own life, the longest-serving sheriff in U.S. history. Joining the force in 1953, he followed the footsteps of his father, who was also sheriff of Pickaway County. For years he worked his way up the ladder until 1961, when he himself was elected sheriff. By the time the letters had started, he was a graduate of the FBI Academy and the president of the Ohio Sheriff's Association. However, dozens of letters began to pop up around town accusing him of perpetrating the cover-up of the murder of Ron Gillespie. The gist of these letters was that Superintendent Massey and Ron's wife Mary had orchestrated his death, and that the sheriff and superintendent were close friends. At the time also, Radcliffe was positioning himself for presidency of the National Sheriff's Association, and having a friend murder your acquaintance would have been a bad look, so he brushed the ordeal under the rug and dismissed it as a drunk driving accident. So what did the Circleville writer put forward as evidence? Mainly the case of Ray Carroll, the Pickaway County coroner who was in the news at the time. He'd been accused of a long list of serious crimes against children and a myriad of sexual assaults, and the trial against him was yet to start. Many people seemed to think that this case was stagnating because the coroner had friends in high places. Letters accused Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe of trying to hide the story and make Pickaway County seem like an idyllic place with no seedy undercurrent whatsoever. Sadly, Mary continued to get horrible letters over the years. In December 1982, she received a letter informing her the writer knew the affair with Massey was still ongoing and threatened her if she didn't admit to it. Finally, in February of 1983 came the last straw. As Mary drove along her scheduled bus route, she saw a sign accusing Massey of raping her daughter. The sign was placed conspicuously close to where her husband died back in 1977, and, in a rage, she stopped the bus on the road sign and went outside to pull the sign down. What gave her pause was a strange box fixed to the back of the sign, positioned around head or chest level. She cautiously checked the back and found a string linking to the sign. Despite the danger, she removed the contraption, set it on the floor of the bus, and finished her route. Knowing something seemed very wrong about this, she brought the box to the police, who found it was booby-trapped. It consisted of a cobbled-together wood box, sealed with glue, filled with cut-up styrofoam bricks. A handgun was fitted tightly into the blocks, and a string was fixed to the trigger. If Mary had pulled the sign down without checking behind it, she could have been shot very easily in the head or chest. Police found that the gun's serial number had been filed off, but it was still pretty clearly visible. It was immediately tied to Paul Freshore, Ron Gillespie's stepbrother. Remember, he married his sister, Karen Sue Gillespie. The pieces began to fall together. Some months earlier, Paul and Karen had finished up a nasty divorce. Remember how Karen was always welcomed to the Gillespie house? How she and Ron's wife had gone on a trip to Florida the day he died? That friendship was true even now that Ron was gone, and Mary let her stay at the trailer on the property. That trailer, I believe, is still there and visible from the road. The leading theory was that Paul had problems with women. He may have grown jealous of Mary Gillespie after meeting her at a family get-together. The anger he infused in his letters to Ron Gillespie was real, but maybe Ron wasn't his immediate target. Remember, the first known target was the superintendent, Gordon Massey. If Paul Freshore was the culprit, he suspected the woman he had a crush on was seeing someone behind the back of his own stepbrother. In his own mind, he probably justified it by saying he'd scare them out of an affair rather than confront them directly. When Gordon and Mary didn't bend to his will, he started sending letters to Ron, urging him to stop the affair himself. These letters had Massey's return address, but not his name. Maybe Paul wasn't the brightest and thought that Ron would take his pickup truck right over to Gordon's house in Circleville. Who knows? Finally, Paul's relationship with Karen began to fall apart. Pure speculation, but maybe Paul Freshore drunkenly called his stepbrother Ron and told him what was going on, that he loved his wife, and that the letters were a misguided but well-meaning attempt at ending what he thought was a real affair. Maybe he got wrapped up in playing the bad guy a little bit too well. When Ron died on the way to confront him in town, Paul realized nobody was left who knew he was the stalker. However, before the booby trap, things weren't entirely in the dumps for Paul, because Paul claimed Karen had cheated on him, which the judge seemed to believe because he gained custody of the children. Karen went to live in a trailer on the Gillespie property. Some claim that Paul's ex-wife set him up to get custody of their own children back, because sure enough, as soon as Paul Frischer was arrested, she got her kids and stood the most to gain. By the way, Paul probably had PTSD from his previous job as a guard at the Ohio State Penitentiary, where a riot broke out in '68. He and 8 others were taken hostage and held by the prisoners for 30 hours, threatened regularly with being burned alive or beheaded. He survived and left to work as an inspector at the Bush plant in Columbus, and always carried a pistol that he'd purchased from a coworker. During the divorce, this gun went missing, according to him. Paul probably figured his ex took it, or that it was lost in the move, and he never reported it to the authorities. This was the gun in the trap made for Mary Gillespie. Maybe Paul set it there after doing a poor job filing the number off. Or maybe his ex-wife partially filed it off, hoping to get her ex-husband arrested. In any case, Sheriff Radcliffe got Paul in a room and performed a rudimentary handwriting test. This consisted of giving him copies of the letters and asking him to copy them as closely as possible. Unusual for a sheriff from a law enforcement family who'd graduated from the FBI Academy, but it was used to get an arrest warrant. I've heard it called similar to handing somebody the murder weapon and then immediately dusting it for prints. They based the handwriting and the analysis off of asking him to copy it. In response, he checked himself into the Southwest Mental Health Center. He had an alibi, and another driver clearly saw a person in a yellow El Camino parked right at the sign that wasn't him 20 minutes before Mary Gillespie rolled up. Eventually, he decided to plead not guilty, but was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Paul had the motive, relationship issues. He had the means. He worked in Columbus, where he could easily send mail. He had the opportunity, often absent from town. But even after being sentenced, the letters continued, thousands of them. Authorities placed him in solitary confinement. He even received his own letters taunting him. Most pushed theories about the case. The main one was that the prosecutor, Roger Klein, who sent Paul to prison, was corrupt. They claimed that Klein got a teacher pregnant early in his career, but killed the child and got help from Sheriff Radcliffe to cover the incident up. Letters continued to claim that Radcliffe was controlling county politics through his cronies, including the coroner, a pedophile. The letter writer's main theory seemed to be that Radcliffe was considered for the presidency of the National Sheriff's Association, and having someone like the letter writer in his county reflected poorly on him. So, the letters claimed, he framed Paul Frischer to get the heat off himself. Again, the story gets muddled here. Key testimony was omitted from the trial, later uncovered by Martin Yant, an investigator with the Innocence Project. Mary Gillespie told the sheriff that another driver saw a yellow Camino parked right next to where the sign was placed. The witness, another bus driver, said that as they drove past, a large man with sandy hair conspicuously moved to make it look like he was urinating, but seemed to be avoiding identification. Paul Frischer was a short, stocky man. Investigator Yant remarked, quote, "They would have found that another possible suspect in the case had a brother who had a yellow El Camino." In 1994, Paul Frischer was released on parole. Letters stopped around this time. He died in 2012, maintaining his innocence. In the years since his arrest, however, it became abundantly clear that there was a sleazy undercurrent to Pickaway County. To begin with, the bus driver that the family meeting initially suspected, David Longberry, was a confirmed creep. In 1999, he went on the run when he was exposed for sexually abusing an 11-year-old girl. There seemed to have been rumors about him for years, and yet there he remained a bus driver. One can only wonder how many victims he truly has. Coroner Ray Carroll, meanwhile, also turned out to have been guilty of the child exploitation he was accused of. He was eventually convicted, and people suspected his trial had been delayed intentionally to protect people in power. So who do you think the Circleville letter writer or writers were? I'd like to know in the comments.